Good evening and welcome to the Border Zone project. Today we discuss developments in regard with Georgia and Ukraine, conflicts in these countries, and my special guest is Ambassador of the United States to OSCE, Ambassador James Gilmer. Welcome to the Border Zone.
Thank you very much, Igor. I'm glad to be here with your viewers.
Thank you very much for your time. Recently, just yesterday actually, so-called State Information Agency of so-called South Ossetia was making a material about your recent statements in regard with conflicts in Georgia, and they said that your statements are in line with some provocative strategy of the United States in regard with independent state South Ossetia. Would you please comment on this and say what is your understanding, and are you acting in some provocative line?
No, I don't think that the objective of the United States is to be provocative at all. The objective here is to stand for the principles of European security and stand for the principles of the final act of the Helsinki Accords with the OSCE. And what that means is that countries who establish themselves as independent countries, they have independent borders, should not have those borders changed by force. Now, what's going on here is that these people purport to be breakaway people. And the truth is that they can't just simply break away. This is still Georgian territory. And efforts to create some sort of fake border is not in line with the principles of territorial integrity within Europe. If you don't stand for that principle, then all of Europe may fly apart. It means that there could be conquest from one country to the other, undermining of one country to the other. And what you end up with is a potential general conflict in Europe. So the United States is really standing for the independence of individual countries.
Could you please tell me, we will get back to Ukraine shortly. Could you please tell me about Georgia? What do you know and what people know in OSCE in regard with current situation here, like recent developments? Do you have some information?
Well, I'm familiar with Georgia. I understand some of its history. But I do understand that this is an independent country. These are people that no longer want to be part of the Russian country. They want to be their own country. And that enables them and gives them the freedom to move west, to move and become a part of the Western community of nations, both in Europe and, frankly, transatlantic, the United States as well. And they're free to be able to do that. And that's, I think, what they want. Now, what I have basically said is that the people of South Ossetia and Abkhazia, they can live comfortably and free, and the United States would support their living comfortably and free within the Georgian country. But Russia cannot come in, occupy those countries, set up a separatist puppet governments and breakaway governments without destabilizing all of Europe. And that's not what we want. We want to see America wants to see Europe stable, the Caucasus stable, and the people of Georgia to be free and independent.
Do you see that United States, as it is stated by many well-known media resources, are using Georgia in the framework of bilateral relations between United States and Russia?
No, I think that Georgia is its own country and it's entitled to its own future. It shouldn't be looking to the past. It should be looking to the future. That's what they want to do. But the United States is in favor of countries being secure within their own borders. I don't think this has anything to do with Russian-American relations. To the contrary, my message to the people of Russia would be that their future also rests with the West and a free and independent democracy. They themselves should not be placing their face against their friends in the West. The United States bears no anger or resentment towards the Russian people. We want nothing but the best for the Russian people. We're not aggressive towards the Russian people. There's no intention to invade, conquer, attack, or do anything like that kind of conflict. None of that is going on. And the people of Russia should not feel threatened. But at the same time, they should not be trying to take over portions of other countries like Georgia, which wish to be independent.
Could you please tell me, are you aware about borderization process in Georgia and this moving, so the so-called border deeper in the Georgian territory, into the Georgian territory?
Well, some years ago, when I was long before I was an ambassador, I spoke with some government officials from Georgia, and even at that time, they were worried about the fact that these so-called separatists, who were supported by the Russian government, were trying to create a border within the country of Georgia. A breakaway group was trying to create an internal border within Georgia. And that would give them the ability to say, well, we're an independent country. Georgia didn't like that because they want their own country. And I don't think that they mean any ill will towards the people of South Ossetia or Abkhazia. And the United States doesn't support any type of anger or aggressive action towards those communities. But an internal border within Georgia is something that Georgia doesn't want. The United States wants to support Georgia as an independent country.
Could you please tell me, you're making statements, you specifically and your colleagues in United States as well, in regard with the borderization and other issues, but what could be some concrete moves, concrete actions to support Georgian territorial integrity in practice, some practical concrete steps? For example, I would highlight that in regard with Ukraine, United States implemented a huge package of sanctions. Why there is no sanctions in regard with Georgia?
Well, I'll have to just take that up with our friends in Washington, as a matter of fact, because we certainly don't support the kind of behavior that's been going on in South Ossetia and Abkhazia. But the United States isn't interested in creating sanctions on people. They simply want to support a free and independent people. I think that the United States and its Western friends and many others simply want a better way of life for people all throughout the South Caucasus. And that means that we should have tourists, we should have friendly relations, we should have the ability to work together on joint projects, we should have the ability to have a unification or a communication between the various parts of the world, and Georgia should not be walled off inside any other place. So what can America do? America and its Western friends can visit Georgia, be friendly with Georgia, create mutual projects with Georgia, and I think that that would be a good thing for the entire region of the South Caucasus.
And any initiatives in the framework of OSCE, is it possible to push this issue there?
Well, we do, as a matter of fact. At OSCE, the Georgian issue is very much on the table and is very much a part of the topics of discussion at the OSCE. Remember, the point of the final act was that there would be an agreement that borders would not be changed by force, that people would have the opportunity to decide their own future, what kind of alliances they want to have for themselves, and that there would be free information flow back and forth among all the countries, free travel, free newspapers, free news. And that way people could decide for themselves what kind of future they want to have. That's our aspiration for Georgia and for others in Europe as well.
But some people from so-called South Ossetia or Abkhazia will say in response that, yes, we decided what future we want to have, and we want this future with Russia, or I don't know. Why do you believe that their future should be exactly in this framework together with Georgia as a part of the country?
Because they were in Georgia. And so then the Russians army invaded, took over the community, supports these people who are separatists. It's very simple. The Russian army simply needs to leave. And then at that point, there could be a discussion about a genuine referendum under international supervision to make decisions about the future of the country. But Georgia intends to have one unified country where everybody is treated fairly and honestly, and that is something what we support. But
from your perspective,
the Russians need to leave. The Russians need to leave. Then at that point, you can have a genuine discussion about the future of Georgia.
In 2 months, we will have a 12 years anniversary of the war, 2008. From your perspective, what was the reason of Russian forces you were talking about a second ago to enter the country? Why did they do that?
I don't think that I know. I think that the Russian community would have to be asked what gain they see in this. But certainly it is, I think, a desire to keep the Russian country together. And they feel like that there's pieces of this along their borders that they need to reach out and try to claim. The danger with all of this is that philosophy then would invite Russian military influence all throughout Europe, and that's the danger that these kinds of issues have. The fact is that the Russians simply need to withdraw their army and let people decide for themselves what their future should be.
Thanks a lot. I would like to ask about other country that is facing the same problems or maybe even harder problems for many years already. I mean, Ukraine. Could you please evaluate the OSCE mission work in this country? Is it effective? If it's not effective?
You're talking about the OSCE activity in Ukraine?
Yeah.
Well, I think that what we're seeing right now is the OSCE once again trying to reach out and make sure that there's a lack of corruption, that there's integrity within the community, that they are protected from invasion. The OSCE is certainly not a military organization in any way, shape, or form, but it does stand for these fundamental principles. And once again, the Eastern breakaway communities there, that the so-called separatists, once again, the Russians simply need to leave and not be a part of that, and then let the country of Ukraine be its unified self. And that would, of course, include the Crimea, which is a part of Ukraine right now.
I saw several statements that you made not so long ago in regard with Ukraine and in regard with policy of President Zelensky in the framework of his attempts to make process more peaceful, move somewhere. But a year passed and nothing really changed, according to my understanding. How do you evaluate this process? Because 6 years ago, Crimea was occupied and the war started in Donbas, and nothing is changing at the moment. So these statements and these briefings from many international organizations, including OSCE, of course, we don't see this effective.
Well, let's look at what the background has been. There was an effort to put together a settlement of this conflict, which is terrible. It's cost, I think, over 13,000 lives, mostly as civilians. It's disrupted the infrastructure and the ability of the people in eastern Ukraine to be able to support themselves. In Crimea, you have seen the indigenous Tatar people abused and prosecuted, and in some cases deported. You've seen the conscription of young people in Crimea into the Russian army. Now, that's a violation of the Geneva Accords to conscript occupied peoples into your military service. That's prohibited by the Geneva Convention. So all of this is underway, but there was an effort to settle all this in Ukraine before the Crimea attempted annexation, which is a serious unanswered problem. I don't know how you get to the bottom of that. How do you resolve that? But there was a Minsk Accord, and the Minsk Accord was going to be an agreement that there was now going to be a settlement of the conflict peacefully, that there would be a disengagement along this line of contact, and people would withdraw. There would be a ceasefire and then a disengagement. And then at some point once the environment was right, then there would be a free and open referendum with international supervision to determine the future of eastern Ukraine. That has not happened. What has happened is that the Minsk Accords now are essentially rejected by Russia after this period of time. They're claiming that it is not they that are violating the Minsk agreements, but the Ukrainians, and that's of course not true. The agreements, the negotiations that have been going on in order to settle this matter are going nowhere. The Russians don't even say now that they're a part of it. They say that they have no role to play in this. And of course, we know that's not true. But what that means is that everything is stalled and everything is frozen. It's very unfortunate. It's very sad. The special monitoring mission of the OSCE is in there in order to try to create stability within the community so that the Minsk settlement can go forward. They are now being harassed. They're being prevented from doing their jobs. This very morning, I saw a camera which had been set up by the OSCE to simply monitor remotely what was going on in the community, which has been shot to pieces by people so that the camera can't take pictures. Not only is it an expense, but more importantly than that, it's a symbol of the fact that the peace settlement process is not going forward.
I read your command statement in regard with human rights violations in Ukraine. So what I wanted to ask whether you have any recommendations. Let's say this. I understand that you are not in a position for recommendations for Ukraine, but like, what is your understanding whether Ukrainian government is moving forward in the right directions in regard with the conflict?
Well, first of all, we always aspire to support Ukraine in a path towards freedom and democracy. We want to make sure that they have the ability to fight against corruption, to fight against wrongdoing, to fight against criminal activity. And we support Ukraine as an independent country, just like we support Georgia and the other countries as well. But so we stand for all of these propositions. But in the end, we have to be very concerned about human rights, not just because they're human rights, but because people can live in a democracy and be free to govern themselves if they have free and open elections without being impinged upon, without being a fraudulent election, without people being afraid of the knock on the door at night. That's an old history that should be gone, but still remains to this day. Crimean Tatars are being abused. They're indigenous people. You know, some people are even being arrested and put into psychiatric institutions, which is an old way of impinging upon people and creating terror and fear within the community in Crimea. And then, of course, there's the conscription issue. You know, you can't just simply take thousands and thousands of young men and put them in a foreign army and then assign them to go to a foreign country in order to serve in a foreign army. That's against the Geneva Convention. These are things that spread terror within the community. And remove the terror, remove the force, let people decide for themselves what their future is, and the Americans will be supportive of that.
Should there be any consequences? There was a common agreement. It was signed. It was approved by all parties, and it's not implementing. So what's next? For example, on behalf of OSCE or United States, what steps could be implemented to make all parties do what they agreed for?
Well, there are sanctions against Russia because of the violation of eastern Ukraine. And there are separate sanctions that are being imposed because of the attempted purported annexation of Crimea. So those sanctions are in place right now. And it's very unfortunate. I don't think anybody wants to sanction anybody in Russia, to tell you the truth. I think that if Russia would, the Russian people would look to the future and not to the past, the Americans will be very friendly people. We're not interested in any kind of conflict with the people of Russia in any way, or even with the government of Russia. But as long as there's this belligerent attitude and an invasion of other peoples, this creates an unstable situation that could lead to a potential conflict all throughout Europe.
Could you please tell me, I watched your interview, I think in December, where you said that Russia should be in OSCE, and Russian ambassador is a normal part of the process. You are talking, he is a nice person, and etc. I'm very interested. Syria, Venezuela, Ukraine, Georgia, before all of this, actually, it was started here in 2008. How could the country, I mean, the leadership of the country, not Russia, of course, be a valuable part of international authoritative organization where, from my perspective, democratic countries are discussing something? Is it a democratic country still for you, for example?
I think one of the benefits of the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, is the ability to actually be able to interact with the people of Russia in an international organization on an equal basis. I think the Russian government likes being in OSCE because it is a chance for them to participate with other countries. The U.S. likes to be in OSCE because we can help to provide some stability in Europe. But the principles of the Helsinki Accord and the Final Act must be adhered to. And those are democracy, human rights, the ability for people to live without being in fear.
So nothing exists in Russia. All of these principles are not in any way related or connected with Russia. So what I'm interested in, you said that OSCE is a good platform to talk to Russian people and etc., but it's not Russian people, it's Russian government. So what I'm interested in, isn't it some kind of legitimacy to Russian government that is blamed for occupations, wars, violations of human rights inside of Russia against its own people, to talk to their representatives on such kind of international platform?
The international platform, the Russian government is a part of the OSCE. The Russian country is a part of the OSCE. And it is an opportunity to speak to the representatives of the Russian government who represent them in the OSCE. But the government of Russia has suggested that NATO is some type of threat. To my knowledge, NATO is entirely defensive. There's no interest at all. Why would anybody think that we want to ever attack or invade Russia? There's just simply no evidence of that. But yet NATO is off to one side. Russia is not a part of that. And then, of course, the European Union is a whole group of Western European countries that are doing mostly economic type of things. Russia is not a part of the European Union. This is a place specifically focused on European security and Eurasian security, where people can interact and talk and try to find a way to the future together. That's the advantage of the OSCE.
You just mentioned the NATO. Could you please tell me, because as we know from Russian media, NATO trainings, for example, in Georgia that take place every year is a big threat to Russian borders. And even Ministry of Defense of Russia is stating that it is a threat. According to your understanding, it is not?
It is not. There is nothing going on that is aggressive or offensive against Russia. Nothing. It is inconceivable that there would be any attack on or invasion of or impingement upon the Russian Federation. It is Georgia that is under attack. It is Georgia that has Russian soldiers within its borders in order to try to keep Georgia from deciding its own future. But they're going to anyway. Sooner or later, it's perfectly clear that Georgia wants to be a sovereign country and it wants to decide its own future.
I think it will be my final question because we have not so much time. Could you please tell me some specific steps that could be, because Georgia, for example, I think Ukraine as well, is waiting for United States and international organizations such as an OSCE to make some specific concrete steps, not only statements. What could it be? For us, for example, together to follow up after?
Well, the OSCE is not a military organization. And even if it was, it wouldn't have any interest in impinging on Russia. It's simply the case that at this point, after the fall of the Soviet Empire, there were a number of countries that were being held by force within that empire. And those countries have now become free and independent. And look at all of them, the three Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. By the way, they're under a great deal of pressure right now from Russia. These are people who want their own future. It's true also for Poland and for Romania and Slovakia, these countries, and then finally down into the Caucasus where you get to Georgia. These are countries that want to define their own future and be independent. Even the Central Asian countries are independent now. They used to be Soviet socialist republics too, but these countries don't want to be part of that kind of country anymore, and that country really doesn't exist at this point. Instead, they want to be free and independent, and that's certainly the principles of the OSCE.
For example, some resolutions in regard with current ongoing borderization process.
Well, certainly, the OSCE, the United States and its allies speak out on this issue all the time. I think maybe it's important for me to say a word about diplomacy. Diplomacy is not about going and having invasions or battles or wars all the time. Diplomacy is about setting down the correct principles and standing by those principles, and then drawing individual people and citizens of countries to those principles. The principles of the final act in the Helsinki Accords are something that is easily available to people on the internet. They can read them and understand what those principles are. And they were entered into in a kinder time, or a better time, between Russia and its Western neighbors, including the United States. But diplomacy is about saying what is right and making it clear to people that there is a beacon of freedom and a beacon of liberty out there, and that they have a right to that freedom in the future for themselves. And as long as you stand for that kind of principle, you give hope and encouragement for people that there could be a better future for themselves and their children. I, for one, aspire to that for the Russian people as well. And I'm confident that in the long run, the Russian people will come into a much brighter future than is presently set out for them now.
Thanks a lot. The final comments, very short. I know we have 2 minutes. Why America is standing, and this is a question I'm asking recent like weeks, when I talk with the U.S. Representative, why United States believe that it is a must or it is a good thing to provide assistance, huge assistance actually, including financial, to Ukraine and Georgia. Why? Because as we know, as we hear very often, it is because of Russia, because these countries are close to Russia.
Well, these countries are the ones that are being impinged on by Russia. These are the countries that are being invaded by Russia. They're the ones that are supporting and propping up fake countries along their borders. That's why the United States wants to be supportive of the aspirations of free peoples, whether they're Georgians or Ukrainians. But it's not just those two. The simple answer is the United States is involved in Europe because we believe that stability in Europe stands for the security, not just of the United States, but of all of our friends all across Europe. Europe has a history of breaking down into conflicts that the United States, it's not in our interest that that kind of thing happen. Our goal here is to promote democracy, freedom, liberty, security, safety, security. That shouldn't just be in Western European countries. The desire for liberty is in the heart of every human being everywhere. And that's in Western Europe, it's in Eastern Europe, it's in Ukraine and Georgia, and I believe it's in the hearts of the Russian people as well. And I'm very optimistic about the future all across Europe. And the United States hopefully can add and assist in creating a better future for everyone. That's our goal.
I think it should be clear now. Thanks a lot for the interview. Thanks a lot for your time. And thank you for following up what is going on here in Georgia and in Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you, and very much appreciate your work.